Hello, and welcome to our Blue Margin Expert Insight series. I'm glad you joined us. The series is for private equity and mid-market executives who want to increase enterprise value with a data-first approach. I'm Blue Margin's Director of Consulting, Kate Eberle, and today I'm hosting SimonMed's VP of Financial Planning and Analysis, Pedro Renteria. Founded in 2003, SimonMed is one of the largest outpatient medical imaging and physician radiology practices in the United States. With over 200 subspecialty trained radiologists, the company operates across 11 states with over 160 facilities. Before SimonMed, Pedro was the VP of FP&A at Frontier Communications, the Senior Director of FP&A at financial services company Early Warning, Finance Controller at Amazon, and Finance Director at American Airlines and U.S. Airways. Pedro, it's so good to have you here. Welcome.
Yeah, happy to be here, Kate.
Awesome. Well, I wonder, maybe just to get us going, if you might share a little bit more about how you got to SimonMed, a little bit about your career and what brought you to where you are today.
Sure. So, I've spent most of my career in finance, from what I would call FP&A to operational finance, right? So worked primarily for public companies. So I started my career in finance with the airlines. So I was with a company called America West and then went through a couple mergers, U.S. Airways and then American, and sort of, grew my career from there. And then he left the airlines in 2015 after that second merger and joined a company called Early Warning. Nobody really knows, except when I tell them that we were the ones who created Zelle. Then I think everyone sort of perks up. So I was with them for about 4 years and then moved on to Frontier Communications as their VP of FP&A. And, that was during the pandemic, and I got a call 2 years after I joined Frontier to, take a look at something that was private equity backed. And I had never really done that, right? Again, as I mentioned, primarily public companies, large companies. It was interesting to me. It was one of those things where I felt like I could really sort of put my fingers on something, right? Small enough where I could play a big role, but big enough where I could also play a role in helping the company sort of take on that growth strategy that they wanted to do. And so American Securities was a firm that purchased SimonMed back in April of 2021. And so, after good conversations, I decided to join, and one of my first sort of goals was to build up an FP&A team, and part of that was also our analytics, right? So our optics into the company, into our performance, and so I thought, this is just a great hands-on opportunity, and that's how I ended up in SimonMed. It wasn't, I haven't had any experience in the healthcare industry, and I think, when I think about my career in FP&A, I really don't think you necessarily need a lot of industry experience at times, because for the most part, the analytics, I think, become, once you get the foundation, fairly similar. You're sort of thinking about the business very similar than other businesses.
Yeah, certainly in the FP&A seat where you're really, digging into the financial numbers first and foremost, but you have to have the connection to the operations.
That's right. That's it, right? You can't, you're basically tied to the hip with operations. And even here at SimonMed, I think the way we think about it is, John Kalix, who's our COO, him and I are sort of, tied together because, and he texts me, I think, probably a few times a week with ideas on, hey, can we look at this? Can we look at that? And so I think that's the great sort of marriage in a company, right, is the FP&A leader being really tied to that COO role, with the CFO being much more leveraged for corporate matters, right, rather than operational.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just curious if you might take us through a little bit of kind of the journey SimonMed's been on in terms of developing BI, getting reports in place, and where you landed today.
Yeah, so I do have to give credit to the company as it's grown. It had in mind, right, a sort of a BI phase of its life cycle, right? So the company had started to build a data warehouse, was containing data in there. There were operational reports that were being sort of, automatically generated and sent out to the organization. I think the problem, though, was that initiative was never really organized, right? So it sort of became one of these things where anytime anybody wanted any kind of data, well, let's throw it into the data warehouse, right? And let's just create a report that auto-generates, right? And so what you had is you just had hundreds and hundreds of reports that were out there that nobody really knew the origin of. Nobody really knew or was tracking the use of them. And so it became a little bit sort of unclean, right? The overall data warehouse was now sort of tainted with all sorts of data that nobody really knew how to best use it, right? And so the endeavor really to clean it up and do the work to sort of use what you had was going to be just so much of a bigger lift than if we just said, hey, let's start over. Right, and I think when American Securities purchased the firm, that was one of the key things that was part of their portfolios. Right, is essentially building out that BI, that analytics layer, so that people have action items, right? And so when I came in, right, the data warehouse had already sort of started to form itself, the new data warehouse, working with the Blue Margin team. And really, I think the goal was to be much more specific about the metrics and the data that we put in there, and really take it slow, right? And the way that happened was, like you said, there had to be alignment on what are the key metrics and the key data that as a company we can align on, right? And one really easy one is obviously patient volume, right? Because that's what drives our business. And so everyone could get around that and say, we need to know what our patient volume is. We need to know it by certain dimensions. We need to know it on a X frequency daily basis. That will tell us how well we're performing. That's one, very high level, right? Very easy that everyone could get around. The second one was conversion, which essentially is, of all the orders or patients that we get referred to us, how many do we actually convert into an actual procedure? And again, these are very high level. At a company level, everyone can get around and say, can kind of come together and say, yes, that's important. And so we started with those first, and then we started to build past that, right? And we then identified the focus areas. So sales was a focus area where they needed access to data because we have no, we have no system for them like anything that would track, customer data in a way that could give them insight into what are our declining referring providers, what are the ones that are growing, right? And so, again, very, very focused around the key metrics that I think as a company we could align, right? It wasn't, I've seen this happen where the initiatives become one of these where you just ask everyone, what would you like to see? And again, then you get in trouble, right? And so we wanted to be very, very sort of methodical about, we're only going to do these, and the next one will be X, and setting our priorities in terms of what we wanted to see. And even when you look at our overall BI reporting, I think some might say, well, wow, you don't have that much data. And that may be true, but we have the key important metrics, right? And so I'd rather have 3 or 4 metrics that we're tracking consistently and that can drive action in the business than having, 30 metrics that we are overwhelmed with and not quite sure, how to take action on any one of them. Because in reality, a lot of times they're all interrelated. And so it's not like you can just tackle one without having to tackle others, right? And so if you can start from sort of like we did with that very top one that everyone can get around, I think then everyone feels good about it and can try to, within their own sort of scope of responsibility, influence that one metric. And that makes it a whole lot easier for us, right? And so, the dissemination of the data also became really important because it's not just important to just auto-generate and send out a report to people, right? We want to make sure that people are going to a central location for all of their data. And so again, Power BI was just great, right? Because we're tying everything that we're doing, and every new metric or dashboard that we build is going to be centralized and available to a subset of key people that need to have access, right? The whole aspect of auto-generating, I don't think we're at that level yet, right? We need to mature a little bit more in where we're going to then be able to create that type of reporting that becomes much more day-to-day, if you want to sort of call that.
Yeah, but definitely I can imagine contrasting to where you were at the start of the effort, hundreds of reports, which you get one filter slightly off or you get one dimension that's pulling in differently, all of a sudden you don't really know what the truth is. So now you've got through Power BI, through the data warehouse, for those, 3 key areas, you know how the company's performing with a couple of clicks, and you can start taking action.
Yes,
yeah.
And that's actually a really good point in terms of the single source of truth. Because when we came in, you could have multiple reports showing our patient volume with different numbers.
Yeah, that's a killer.
And let me tell you, it's not that the reports were wrong. It's just, again, different filters, different data being included, and so you really had to go. We had to go through the process of determining what is it that we truly define as a patient, right? And that becomes so important because then everyone, once again, gets on board with that, and we're speaking the same language, right? We now don't have any issues of saying, hey, someone's saying we did 10 patients and, someone else is saying we did 20. Well, no, that's gone, right? Because we have a single source of truth in BI where everyone can come and look and see on a daily basis what those numbers are, right? So, And that's extremely critical. So I'm glad you brought that up, for sure.
Yeah. And I think, it sounds so good conceptually. Like it makes so much sense. But I'm wondering if you can share any maybe concrete examples of ways that it's empowered the team to drive the company forward, maybe in sales or even the tech productivity side.
Yeah, so I'll give you 2 examples, right? So even the most simple things like our patient volume, and you can see this in our sites now, right? Everyone at our sites has access to it, and everyone is taking pride in those goals, right? Because we're not only presenting actuals, but we're also presenting things like budget or forecast. And so folks know where they're at, right? And where they're sitting at any given point in time during the month. And that sort of empowers them with the ability to make changes at the site, right? Be flexible about, okay, well, I'm not meeting my numbers. What do I need to do? And it's not solely focused on necessarily, hitting your numbers, but it's also focused on giving the sites a sense of sort of ownership over their operations, right? And I think you see it. We just had a board meeting, and John, our COO, showed pictures of how sites now have, boards where they're also similarly tracking sort of performance, right? And they're putting it out in front of everyone, the whole team, right? So that everyone knows where we're sitting and what can be done, right? And can we make, if we had some people cancel, could we make some calls and call other patients that might want to come in that same day, right? So that it just leads to much more ownership and action around it, right? And that is as simple as saying, hey, let's give you your patient volume, right? You wouldn't think it would have that kind of impact, but it really does, right? Data does really give people a sense of belonging and ownership, right? Such that they know what's at stake versus just simply going through the motions of, seeing patients and having them go through our machines, right? The sales team, same thing. I would say, the sales team, like I mentioned, they didn't really have access to data in a way that could tell them how to target, right? And so, with the help of your team, we built reports that would give them a sense of declining referring providers, those that are growing, changes in terms of different modalities, or if someone left the practice, right? That data is now visible to them, right? And so, while I think at the lower level, at the sales rep level, it's really impactful, I think, to be honest, where the biggest value is, in my mind, is at the director level, right? Because while they may not be out on the, call it so-called floor or out engaging with the referring providers, they have to be able to manage and mentor and sort of guide the sales reps, right? And without that level of information, I don't know how they would do it, right? They would have to ride along with every single sales rep to figure things out. Now they can have really pointed discussions around some of our referring providers and the activities that each sales rep is doing to get the business to refer more physicians or to highlight key services that we offer so that we can get more referrals, right? In my mind, I think I see the benefit more at the sort of like the director level. But again, sales is about hitting numbers. And so, as a sales rep, knowing where you stand is also super important, right? And knowing where that target is and how you might be able to beat it because there's variable comp associated with it. So that to me is more about giving them a sense of where they are, where they're standing, and what they need to do. But for the directors, I think it just gave them a lot more ability to mentor and manage the team, right? Which I think is extremely important, right? Because we expect our regional directors to be the ones to sort of guide the team in terms of the overall corporate directive and goals, right? And I think without any of that data, they were sort of flying blind.
Yeah, and in general, they probably got to where they were because their guts are pretty reliable. They're good
Yes.
sense on where they need to coach someone, but man, you back that up with data, and it almost eliminates any of the, well, I disagree. Like you don't
Yes.
have to have that back and forth. It's like, these are the facts. You're not hitting
Yes.
your numbers.
Yes.
Makes it so much
Yes.
more easier to cut through.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm curious, is there anything with the reports that we developed that surprised you? Or in the change management process, was there a period of friction, or did people, once they saw the data, attach to the value pretty quickly?
It depends, right? So again, like the volume one, I think it was fairly easy to transition. I think the ones that were a little bit harder to transition were maybe our conversion reporting. And more lately, our tech productivity reporting. And the reason for that is I think those carry a lot more sensitivity in terms of, identifying an issue and sort of what you don't want to do is point the finger, right? That's not what these reports are meant to do. But in a sense, they do point you to where the problem is. And at times that can be very difficult because then, what will happen is folks will want to argue around the logic. And say, well, there's something wrong with the logic because it's not a problem here, right? And I think with conversion, which affects not only our site, but it affects our call center, right? It affects our sales team's efficiency. You sort of have these three groups that are very obviously focused on doing well in their own scope, right? That they feel that they're doing everything they can. And so these have a little bit more, skin in the game, right? Where you're trying to point out, well, this isn't working. And I think folks have a harder time with accepting ones that really sort of point to a problem, right? Because, look, I think human nature, everyone wants to do their best and nobody wants to necessarily be put on the spot for any kind of, deficit or failure, right? And that's not how, as we think about these, this is not how we envision these reports to be used, and this is how we communicate to everyone, where we say this is not to identify who is the person who's not doing the right thing. This is in general to help us identify process changes that we need to make, right? Or insight into why we may not be converting someone. Because only then can we then change, right, our process or our approach to make sure that we are converting patients or that we are getting to our patients first. So those, I think, and then when you talk about productivity, obviously, productivity in itself has it's a very sensitive sort of word, right? Where saying someone is not productive obviously raises, can raise their temperature a little bit. And so we just need to, those are the type of reports that we spend a lot of time working with the business partners to iterate and iterate and iterate. And what I mean by iterate is not necessarily that we change the reporting, but that we iterate talking about it, right? So that we, every month or every quarter, we have a conversation about it, right? So that we can make sure that people are not necessarily, that they're looking at it. Two, they're bringing up issues that they're seeing in the reporting, because again, it is very sensitive, right, when you talk about productivity. And three, right, that they have a mechanism to voice those concerns, right? And we always want to give them that, because if we don't, then I think what will happen is they'll just believe the data is wrong, not say a word, not use it, and 6 months later you find out nobody's even looked at something, or actually uses it for making decisions, which I'm glad to say we actually use all of our reports for decision making, right? So our productivity reports, our conversion, all of those are really actionable, and they lead to the specific groups doing something about it, right? We even use it to look at ROI, right? So especially with productivity. When someone says, "Oh, I think I need another tech," well, let's go look at the productivity around the site, right? And let's see if that makes sense. Oftentimes, that is what's needed, right? We've already maxed out productivity with our current techs, and so. Right. But again, back to your point around that's factual, right? And someone can point to it and can say, "See, I'm telling you, it is not one of these where someone tells us a site is productive, but we have no way of measuring it," right? And this just makes it so easy to have conversations about hiring for new positions, or potentially even hard conversations about whether we're not productive and we need to make some reduction in hours. It's factual, right? It's very hard for someone to then say, "I don't believe it," because it's essentially there, and everyone after time has bought into it and aligned to it, right? So I think the tough ones are the ones that are much more around actually impacting groups or potentially finding failure points. Those become really sensitive for people to make sure that they understand and get behind, right?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I love that you shared is and going back to that feedback loop. So it's not just, these are the reports that we're mandating down upon you, and like it or not, this is how we're judging, but actually getting that buy-in, saying, look, you know your job and the day-to-day better than anybody. So if there's something that's in this report that is not tracking to what you see, you now have a concrete way of talking about it. No, we're counting something in the denominator we shouldn't be, and I want to raise that to my leadership team so I'm getting better measurement of my productivity versus you're wrong.
Yes.
Your assessment of my performance is wrong, and having no common language to talk about that without data and a shared report.
Yes, absolutely. I think there always has to be communication from the beginning to the very end, right? The reports can't be, to a certain degree, static, right? They cannot, and I think that's where, as I mentioned, when I first got here, where the company was, I think a lot of these reports had become just basically static, right? Things that just
set it and
went
forget
out.
It.
Yeah. And so, that doesn't drive good, confidence around the data. It also doesn't drive good alignment around the company. And so, again, having those communication points, and I say having those communication points because I'm the main person, right, on the finance side that essentially takes on that communication loop with John and his team. And the good thing is I think everyone feels comfortable to voice, right, their opinion, which is also, I think, what good data creates, right?
Yeah, strong culture. That's
strong culture, strong engagement, right? And because without that, I think people would feel, whether fearful or not confident to speak up, right? Now they can, right? Because they have the tools available for them to actually be resourceful and determine whether or not something's wrong. And that, I think that's very empowering for an organization.
Yeah. Well, we're coming kind of up to the close of our time together. Couple questions as we start to wrap up. You mentioned ROI. If you had to look at the impact the reporting has made on SimonMed, any key takeaways that you could share in terms of just what this visibility into a handful of targeted reports is getting you?
Yeah. So look, I will say ROI around BI reporting can be difficult. And a lot of it is because it's oftentimes very, very difficult to quantifiably say, this is what I'm going to get out of this report. There's a lot of obviously really good non-quantifiable information, right? And sort of anecdotal information around having good information. So I think you can't look at every report and say, well, go tell me what the ROI is for that, right? Because it's just not going to be possible. It's just impossible in my mind. I think what you have to think about first is, do we as a company value a data-driven decision-making process? And do we ultimately believe that that leads to value for the organization? And that's the first key question I think you have to ask yourself. If the answer is yes, then you are on your way to creating value for the organization. And the reason I say that is because, most people are going to be able to know the metrics that they want to see, right? And then as you collaborate with others, you'll start to bring together metrics with others that will give you more insight, right? And that to me already is value in itself. I can't quantify. So let me say it a different way. We implemented the sales reporting. We know that sales reporting in essence is a good thing and that people should have data, right? Can I necessarily point to, hey, because we did that report, we're now driving 10 more patients? Not necessarily. But do I look at the health of the company and know that I took steps that I believe were going to be the right steps? And is the health of the company better? Yes, right? That is absolutely, at a high level, yes. And so all of these things, as we think about, right, our overall strategy, we know that there's value in data and decision-making around data. And so as long as we can be purposeful around the metrics we measure, then I think the value is ultimately there long run. Again, cannot think of this as a short run situation, right? This is a very long run. And so that allows you to see the health of a company and the culture of a company at point A to long term, what was it at point B? And having been here almost 2 years, and I can tell you that what we've done and where we were at point A 2 years ago, we are steps ahead of where we were then. And it even just feels better. And even, performance-wise, the company's doing better, right? And so there are key large indicators that are telling us we're doing the right thing, right? And again, we're purposeful about what we invest in, right? So, we're not running and grabbing 30 metrics and building dashboards. We're saying we've got 5 metrics, let's focus, and then if one more comes up, let's talk about it and see how that relates, right? So again, methodical and purposeful, right? And I think as long as you believe that overall data-driven decisions are important, then I think you're on the right path, right? And I say that thinking that everyone believes that, but I've been in companies where that is not the case, right? Where intuition and hunch is valued more than data, which in this case I would disagree with, right? I think data-driven decisions make for good decisions.
Yeah. It protects everyone's sanity. It means that at the end of the day, you can go back and actually see if it was the right decision. You have your hypothesis and you're going and looking at the data later. Yeah, I mean, you're speaking our language. I have to agree with you there. And I think it is such a good point. I feel like in some ways, I'm always hoping I can find that client who says, man, this saved me $1 million. That's the dream, because I think everybody would love to say that, because then you can do so many more reports. But at the end of the day, you're talking about some of the intangibles. You're seeing culture benefits. You're seeing probably better alignment with your executive team, more clarity on where you need to focus your strategic initiatives. And just from a sanity perspective, that's a huge game changer, because you all can now lead better and do your jobs versus mucking around in the data.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And to me, that's value, right? Again,
absolutely.
Can't necessarily point to the $1 million in savings, but I can certainly point to where we were 2 years ago and where we are now in the health of the company, and it's day and night.
Yeah, awesome. Well, one last question. Any advice that you would give either to yourself from 2 years ago before as you were starting at SimonMed, or maybe other folks who are just starting the journey with data?
maybe it's not advice that I would give myself, but I think what I wish I would have had was a little bit more time, right? To fully get a grasp of where the company was, because look, to be honest, I came in and everything was very fast moving, right? So we were moving, right? And I wish I had had a little bit more time to digest. Because I think that could have given us an opportunity to potentially identify a few other key related metrics, right, that would have gone really well with our patient volume, with our sales sort of reporting, with our conversion. And that would have been a great benefit because we would have had those things earlier. We've sort of developed them post, right? Like we've added a little bit, we've enhanced our conversion, right? We built tech productivity, but I think if I had had a little bit more time to digest and the team would have had a little bit, we would have had these tools earlier, which would have had a greater benefit earlier on, right? So, it's a little bit of wanting to be where we are now a little bit faster, right? But look, we've had great success, right, with all of the reporting that we've done. Great engagement from the team. It's hard to say that we could have done better, right? We've made a true impact, and I think while I want it to be better, it's always in hindsight, right? 2020.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think it's probably pretty, maybe not unique to the PE environment, but there's always that tension between, man, let's go and just see what we can get in terms of an MVP, and should we slow down to speed up eventually? And I think that's such a tension. You've got a short time horizon. You're trying to make as much of an impact as possible. If you can get the cut through, great. But maybe spending that extra week or two with the whole ELT in a room, getting some roadmap would then allow you to just churn through things even faster. So it's an interesting tension. Yeah. That's right. Agree fully. Awesome. Well, all right. Well, it's been great to talk today, Pedro. Just wondering, anything else on the horizon for you and SimonMed from a BI perspective, or just staying the course and taking off more metrics?
I think there's a few things that are coming up, right? So I think we've been a little bit we've not stagnant, but we've wanted to use the tools we've built to make sure we had the engagement and the value out of them. I think, again, this is where having that time, you start to think about other things that could come into play, right? So, I think our financials could be something that are also a good candidate for bringing into Power BI. Again, back to sort of a central location. Information around our RCM, right, which is our revenue cycle management. Those type of optics we currently don't have, at least from my side, from the finance side, we don't have good optics into it, despite the fact that we have a good RCM team. But I think those would allow us to essentially tap into so many more opportunities, right, around the revenue cycle side and around sort of untapping some of the revenue potential that we have. I think we've been so focused on making sure the operations is running well and that the sales team is, sort of clicking, that now I think we have a real opportunity to start untapping some of that revenue potential that is not necessarily sales or operations related, right?
Sure.
It's more payer related in our business, right? Insurance, reimbursement. So, a lot of cool things to come.
Yeah. Well, again, it's been great to chat with you today. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge we're alumni of the same university, University of Puget Sound.
That's right.
Never find
go Loggers.
Yeah, go Loggers. Tough to find other ones in the wild. So always good to chat, Pedro. Hope you have a great rest of the summer.
Thank you, Kate. Good talking to you.